In 1911, a single line in a congressional record hinted at a power most Americans had never really confronted. The federal government had never directly claimed a share of a citizen's labor. That sentence was not printed in a pamphlet or whispered in a hallway. It sat inside an official record, waiting for someone to notice what it implied. Then came 1913, and everything changed with uncanny speed. A constitutional amendment, a new tax system, and a central banking law all arrived in the same year. For the first time, federal power could reach directly into personal income. And almost at the same moment, a central system emerged to manage the nation's debt. Before 1913, Washington relied mostly on tariffs, import duties, and excise taxes. Those taxes touched commerce, not the daily labor of ordinary workers. That difference sounds technical, but it is the heart of the story. A tariff appears when you buy something. Income tax appears because you worked. In that older system, a person could harvest, build, trade, and save without a direct federal claim on the paycheck. That boundary did not survive the next decade. A Civil War income tax had existed briefly, and then it vanished. Later, the Supreme Court struck down another attempt in Pollock v. Save Farmers Loan and Trust Company. The legal logic mattered. A direct income tax, not properly apportioned among the states, conflicted with the Constitution. That made the next move politically urgent, and yet the public story is often told as if the amendment simply passed because reformers wanted it. The paper trail suggests a far more layered picture. A good question is simple. Who benefits when government gains a permanent, flexible claim on personal earnings? Farmers, artisans, and miners did not design that machine. One theory is that the strongest support came from financial institutions and centralizing planners. Income tax does not only collect money, it can also expand the state's future borrowing power. That same year, the Federal Reserve Act became law. To some historians, the coincidence feels accidental. To others, it looks like two pieces of one architecture. At first, the system was tiny. In 1913, the highest rate was only 7%, and many wealthy earners paid nothing at all. That is how new power enters history. Small, temporary, almost harmless. Then the exception becomes the rule, and the rule becomes permanent. By 1944, the highest federal income tax rate had reached 94%. By then, the original promise of a small adjustment was long gone. The real issue was never the first rate, it was the precedent. Once the door was opened, the future could be rewritten behind it. And once you look at that shift, the silence around the old world becomes striking. Workers, farmers, and builders once kept what they earned in a very different legal climate. Local and state taxes existed, yes, but the federal government had not yet claimed a direct piece of the individual's productive labor. That is why the change felt so strange. The category itself was born first, and only then did the punishment arrive for not complying. In the 1910s and 1920s, the tax code expanded, penalties sharpened, and enforcement became more organized. A new bureaucracy was quietly taking shape. By 1943, withholding changed the psychology entirely. People no longer handed over the tax after seeing the money. The money was taken before it ever arrived. That shift made gross income feel abstract and net pay feel natural. In practice, the state had redefined what a paycheck meant. Britain, Germany, France, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all adopted income tax systems in overlapping historical windows. The pattern was broader than one nation. So the question remains, if the new tax was only about fairness, why did 1913 also build the financial machinery that could make it permanent? Maybe that is the story worth following next. In Washington, the real battle was no longer about whether taxes should exist. It was about who would control the machinery that collected them, and how quietly that machinery could grow. That meant forms, filing rules, and enforcement had to be invented, almost at the same time as the law itself. Without those pieces, the new system would have remained a promise on paper. And that is where the story shifts from legislation to administration. Once a government can classify income, it can also define refusal, delay, and non-compliance. That sounds technical, but it is the heart of the matter. A tax is not just a number, it is a relationship between the person earning and the power collecting. And once that relationship was formalized, the debate moved into offices, not streets. Lawyers, accountants, and budget men became the real architects of the new order. What made this moment so unusual was the speed. A system that should have taken decades began taking shape in just a few short years. Field offices began appearing across the country, each one carrying the same instructions, the same ledgers, and the same logic. The structure was becoming national, because once collection becomes routine, resistance becomes paperwork, and paperwork, unlike speeches, can be multiplied without much public attention. That is why the early records matter so much. They show not just a policy, but a deliberate effort to make compliance feel ordinary. And ordinary is the most powerful disguise in government history. If people accept the process, they stop asking who built it. The next layer was enforcement. A tax without consequences is fragile, so the state had to decide how far it would go when people ignored the notice. Once penalties entered the picture, the tax code stopped feeling like a request and started behaving like a command. By then, the language of administration had become a language of obligation. People were no longer just filing papers, they were being sorted into categories, and categories are where governments become durable. Once people are placed inside a system, the system can be expanded without reopening the first debate. That is why the archives feel so revealing. They do not show a grand announcement. They show the small procedural steps that made expansion possible. A memo, a circular, a revised form. Those unglamorous objects are where power lives. Big turning points often begin as office supplies. Once those papers existed, the public had to be taught what they meant. That is when educational campaigns, notices, and instructions became part of governance. And that is how a policy becomes culture. People begin to speak the language of the form, even when they never asked for the form itself. Then came the deeper shift. When payment is expected on a schedule, the idea of personal earning starts to feel conditional. What once felt earned now feels pre-managed. That feeling is hard to measure, but it matters. A government that can condition income can also condition behavior, planning, and fear. That is why some historians focus less on rates and more on administration. Rates change, but administrative habits are what actually endure. You can see the same pattern in other reforms of the era. A temporary necessity arrives first, then the paperwork hardens, and finally the exception becomes the norm. That is the part people rarely notice while reading the headline. The headline says tax. The archive says institution, procedure, and permanence. So when we ask whether the shift was accidental, we are really asking a larger question. Was the country simply modernizing, or was a new relationship being designed on purpose? And that question is where the story truly opens up. Because the next files do not just explain how taxes changed, they show who stood to gain from making that change permanent. Then the paperwork itself begins to speak. A stack of tax forms from the early 1900s shows how quickly a new system needed language before it had habits. At first, the documents look almost harmless, but each line told a citizen how to classify himself, and classification was never just bookkeeping. The most revealing part was not the numbers. It was a signature block where a taxpayer had to turn private earnings into something publicly legible. And once a form exists, the government can insist on an answer. That is when a procedure stops being optional and starts becoming authority. What happened next was not dramatic in the newspapers. It happened in office routines, where clerks quietly trained a country to comply. One small instruction sheet could change behavior more than a speech ever could. A citizen reading it learned that delay itself had consequences. The archive even hints at the human cost. Behind every rule was a person trying to decide whether silence was safer than honesty. Then came the first wave of public notices. They were printed in a dry, bureaucratic tone, but they carried a new social expectation underneath. People rarely notice when instructions become culture, but once everyone expects the same paperwork, resistance begins to look abnormal. That is why the early memos matter. They show a state learning not just to collect, but to normalize the act of being collected from. And in the margins, one detail keeps returning, the language of obligation, not suggestion, not request, obligation. That single shift changed the emotional geometry of the tax system. A household no longer just earned income. It began anticipating judgment. That is also why enforcement mattered so much. A rule without a consequence is a suggestion wearing a uniform. A few years later, the administrative tone had hardened. What began as accounting now carried the weight of compliance and inspection. By the time the system settled, it no longer felt new. That is often how durable institutions arrive. Quietly, then everywhere at once. And yet the archive still holds its small surprises. One ledger note suggests officials worried less about money than about obedience. That matters because money can be counted, but obedience has to be manufactured. The paperwork was doing both jobs at once. The quietest clue may be the office furniture itself. Desks, drawers, and cabinets became the invisible machinery of a new civic habit. Some researchers point to that as the real turning point. Not the statute alone, but the domestic routine it created around itself. Because once routine exists, the public stops asking when it began. It simply becomes the way things are done. If that sounds mundane, that is the point. The most consequential systems often arrive dressed as office common sense. And there was always a second layer underneath the paperwork. The expectation that citizens would keep adapting without being asked. A few archivists hint that this was the real innovation. Not collection itself, but the ability to make collection feel ordinary. That is why these records still matter now. They do not just show paperwork. They show how a country teaches itself new limits. And if another folder surfaces from the same era, I want to know what else was being built quietly beside it, because the paper trail rarely ends where the headline does. Then a different question appears in the files. Why did the same decade suddenly demand so many new categories of income? The language changes first, and only later does the law catch up. That shift was not only legal, it was psychological. Once income could be named, measured, and sorted, it became easier to treat it as something the state could approach. And once a state learns to name a slice of earnings, it rarely forgets the size of the slice. That is the quiet turn hidden inside these records. A political coalition had to make that idea feel ordinary. They did it by wrapping a new fiscal power in the familiar language of fairness and shared burden. But fairness was only the public wrapper. Beneath it, the real prize was leverage over private earnings, and with leverage comes permanent influence. The archive trail then points to a second layer. The people organizing taxation were often thinking in categories, exemptions, and predictable behavior, not just revenue. That matters because once behavior is predicted, policy can be designed to steer it. The system starts looking less like a collection tool and more like a discipline. And once discipline enters the picture, the machinery around it grows teeth. New rules arrive with new forms of pressure, and people begin adjusting before anyone needs to force them. One overlooked detail in the records is timing. Major powers rarely appear fully formed. They arrive through timing, repetition, and the slow acceptance of a new normal. That normal feels invisible once it settles in, yet the archive keeps showing the same pattern. First a proposal, then a tool, then a habit. The next clue appears outside the capital, in ordinary households and workplaces. People do not debate doctrine there. They adjust to what arrives in the mail and the marketplace. That is where the story becomes social, not just governmental. A policy survives when it is absorbed into routine, and routine often starts in private spaces. A small office notice can do more than a grand speech. It can teach millions what to expect, what to fear, and what to accept without noticing the lesson. And once expectations shift, the rest is almost mechanical. The rule no longer feels new. It feels inevitable, as if it had always been waiting there. The most revealing documents are often not the loudest ones. A dull amendment, a bookkeeping instruction, or a quiet procedural note can reshape the state's reach. So the archive does what headlines cannot. It shows the small steps. The state does not always leap. Sometimes inches forward until resistance is too late. What makes this period unsettling is not a single dramatic decree. It is the way multiple quiet changes can stack into one new reality. No single folder explains it all, but when several folders point in the same direction, the pattern starts speaking louder than the individual pages. And the direction is hard to miss. Private earnings become legible to distant power, then routine, then expectation, until the new arrangement feels natural. That is why the question of motive refuses to disappear. If the change was innocent, why did it arrive with such remarkable architectural precision? Architecture leaves traces. Even when the public story is simple, the underlying structure often reveals planning, sequence, and intent spread across years. So the deeper read is not just about money, It is about whether a republic quietly converted a private earning into a permanent public claim. That claim, once normalized, changes the relationship between the individual and the center. It teaches the center to expect and the individual to anticipate. And if that sounds abstract, look again at the paper trail. The most powerful systems are often built so slowly that the generation living inside them stops naming the change. That is where this investigation leaves us, not with a slogan, but with a structure. And if another folder surfaces from the same era, it may show what else was built beside it. The next folder did not contain a grand decree. It held a narrow correspondence trail, the kind people miss when they only scan headlines. Across those letters, one phrase appears again and again: the government must make the system work in practice, not just in theory. That is where the real story begins. A question emerged from the margins of one memo: if citizens were now expected to submit their earnings on schedule, what else had to change behind the curtain? The answer was not written in one sentence. It was assembled through revisions, circulars, and small procedural adjustments that slowly became policy. And here is the unsettling part. Once the revisions started, they did not stop at one office. They spread into the daily habits of ordinary people. A clerk stamps a form. A worker folds it into a coat pocket. A household begins adjusting its month around a new rule it barely understands. What looks like paperwork is often power in its quietest clothing. By the time people notice the pattern is already living with them. One office diary notes that people rarely object to a rule until the first deadline arrives. Then the calendar becomes part of the law. Then came the correspondence about money moving before people ever held it. That change rewired the entire emotional logic of pay. A paycheck no longer felt complete. It arrived already divided by an unseen hand, and the subtraction began to feel normal. That is how systems become invisible. First, they are technical. Then they are routine. Eventually, they are just the way life works. Somewhere in the same paper trail, another note mentions not persuasion, but expectation. That word matters more than most people realize. The archive never says the shift was sudden. Instead, it shows small steps that were easy to overlook when taken one at a time. One office note even reads like a warning in plain language. A rule repeated often enough can become harder to question than a law. By the time that happens, the question is no longer whether people agree. The question is whether they can imagine life before the rule. And that is where the deepest change hides. Not in money, but in memory. A society can forget the old condition and call the new one natural. A person born into that normal never sees the old boundary unless someone opens the cabinet and points to the first page. The cabinet, of course, is not just a cabinet. It is the habit of storing power in plain sight until no one remembers to ask why it is there. A few pages later, the tone changes. The same system stops sounding experimental and starts sounding inevitable, as if no other arrangement was ever possible. That is the trap of administrative history. It rarely announces itself as destiny. It arrives looking like housekeeping, yet housekeeping can be the first disguise of permanence. Once the drawers are labeled, the habit has somewhere to live. The folders do not shout, they wait. That patience is what makes them dangerous, because waiting turns into heritage when nobody is looking. And once a habit becomes heritage, people defend it without knowing why. They inherited the structure, then mistook it for common sense. That may be the archive's last trick. It teaches you to admire the sequence and overlook the intention. But sometimes the sequence itself is only the surface of a system built to hide what money was really doing. So the file ends not with certainty, but with a clearer question. If a nation can redraw the rules of labor, credit, and obligation, what other system was hidden in plain sight before anyone thought to question it?